Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
You are listening to Women's Running Stories, the podcast where exceptional women runners share inspirational stories about their running experiences.
Hi, my name is Katie Steele. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and work with athletes and integrating athlete mental health into athletic systems. And I am a mom of 3 kids, and that is my absolute joy.
Yes, this episode features Katie Steele, who today is a mom and a therapist, but many years ago she was a competitive runner. And that is the story you're about to hear. It is powerful and it is shocking. And this episode is being released on the occasion of the publication of the excellent new book that Katie co-authored called The Price She Pays. But before you hear more from Katie, I want to welcome you to Women's Running Stories. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of this podcast. Thank you so much for being here. This is an important story, and I'm really happy that you're here to listen to it. So yes, this episode features Katie Steele, and Katie is a licensed marriage and family therapist and the co-founder of Thrive Mental Health, which is an outpatient medical clinic in Bend, Oregon. Katie is also the executive director of the Athletes Mental Health Foundation, which is a nonprofit created to help young athletes understand and address their internal well-being. Also, Katie has a podcast. She is the co-host with Tiffany Brown of the excellent new show, Sports Shrinks. And today, June 18th, 2024, does indeed mark the publication date of the outstanding new book, The Price She Pays, Confronting the Hidden Mental Health Crisis in Women's Sports from the Schoolyard to the Stadium by Katie and Tiffany Brown, with Erin Stroud, who is well known for her years of excellent journalism in the running world, especially on the women's side of the sport. I want to read you an excerpt from the book synopsis put out by the publisher just to give you a sense of what The Price She Pays is about. And it says, informed by their experiences both on and off the field, authors Katie Steele and Dr. Tiffany Brown help athletes and parents identify the signs and symptoms of mental health conditions, recognize mistreatment and abuse, understand body image and eating disorders, trauma, and more. By tackling these issues, The Price She Pays encourages readers to understand how well-being and the whole person, not just the athlete, will lead to performance gains from the youth leagues to the elite levels and everything in between. And yes, Katie Steele has a lot of experience off and on the field, which has fueled the drive for the work she does because Katie's own journey demonstrates just how devastating a young woman's athletic experience can become. I'll let you know right up top here that Katie's running story is heartbreaking and tragic in so many ways. And like I said, it's important. It's important because while her story is hers and hers alone, there are so many elements in her journey that are common to so many other women, myself included. And those similarities revolve around harm being done in the name of athletic performance. And although Katie's story happened many years ago, the same sorts of systems and attitudes that allowed her running experiences to unfold in the way they did are as strong as ever up to today. I do want to add here that despite everything she's gone through, Katie Steele still loves to move her body in the outdoors. Today, she is an avid mountain biker, and she continues to see the exceptional value in being an athlete. She is determined, however, to make sure it gets better. There are a couple of people I want to identify up top here, Katie mentions Alberto, and that is now disgraced running coach Alberto Salazar. In 2019, he was, to quote a New York Times article, banned for life from being, quote, allowed to participate in any activity put on by or under the auspices of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee or any sport national governing body, unquote. In other words, as I read it, Salazar was banned from being involved in elite-level running. At the time when Katie knew him, however, Salazar was a really influential running coach and a big force in the running world. He was a highly respected former world-class runner, and he was well known for being the head coach of the now defunct elite running group, the Nike Oregon Project. And Katie, having grown up in Oregon, where Salazar was also based, she had crossed paths with him long before she entered college, where Salazar would become a big influence in her running life. Katie also mentions Dr. Brown, and this is endocrinologist Dr. Jeffrey Brown, who worked closely with Salazar. There are a few other items that come up in this story, and I just really want to make sure that it's clear what Katie's talking about. First of all, she talks about not menstruating during her competitive running career. I want to emphasize here that this is common, but it is not normal. It is actually really unhealthy. Katie also mentions medical redshirting, and this just means that an athlete who is in college takes time away from their sport due to a medical condition. In essence, it means that they stop competing. And lastly, something to know is that Katie's experience as an athlete was so traumatic, she actually doesn't remember a lot of what happened. There are a lot of gaps in her memory, which is a fairly common response to trauma. And a lot of the details that Katie now knows, she learned from reading through medical records that were kept by her local endocrinologist in Oregon. All right, now let's get to it. Let's hear Katie Steele's running story, beginning with when Katie did first discover the pure joy of moving her body and being outdoors. Here to tell her story is Katie Steele.
I feel so lucky to have grown up in a family that was active. My parents were active. They were both runners. They would run every morning. And so we do all these family outings that involved physical activity. And so I fell in love with movement. I think in part because of how I felt and that freedom and liberation that you feel small when you're out in the mountains, and also the sharedness with the people I love most in the world. There was a ritual that my parents created called Peak of the Week. And we would find, I live in Oregon, and we would find different mountains each week of the summer to go and hike. And we'd pack snacks and we'd make it a whole experience. And so the sharedness and liberation was that first entry point into movement that I just loved and couldn't get enough of. And over time, that morphed into finding running, but it started with just moving my body and being with the people that I love most in the world.
Katie developed that love of moving her body from a young age, and over time, that transformed into a love of athletic competition, with organizations including the Amateur Athletic Union, or AAU.
As a elementary school kid playing kind of any community sport that there was, going into the AAU kind of travel teams through middle school, and then I really settled into running in high school. And what drew me to it was the coach. I had a really, really strong bond with the coach and felt like she really understood me and valued me. And so I chose to prioritize running over some of the other sports that I had participated in. I look back now, right? Hindsight 2020 is a funny thing because we have more context. We don't know what we don't know in the minute, but I am highly driven. And so to me, I look back now and I'm like, it's no surprise that I loved competing and I loved the drive and I loved the diligence and consumption that competition required. Tending to all the details. I love operating in overdrive. And there's this rush that comes with competing and focusing on the outcome and wanting to do better and having goals and working so hard to achieve those goals. And you don't always. And that's part of the fun of sport, right? Is there's devastation and heartbreak and sadness that can come too. And yet the pleasure and joy and adrenaline and community and place of belonging that is formed is so fueling that I loved that. I felt and quite frankly, even though I haven't been a competitive athlete in decades now, I still feel most connected to my core self when moving, when exercising, when pushing myself to new bounds to try new things. That's when I feel my most at peace. I am really close to my parents and my sister, and I ran with my dad in the mornings, and it was something he had loved doing, and it was a way that we would bond. And I remember my parents engaging in running, but it was definitely not something that they pushed. I drove that. And I think about that now, especially when parents ask so many questions around, what should I do with my kid? And it's like, no, your kid has got to drive the ship, right? It has to be intrinsically led. More pressure isn't going to make your kid a better athlete. Your kid is going to make that choice of if that's something they want to commit to or not. And so I always felt support from coaches and from my parents and my sister and my friends. It was definitely a community thing, but it was in those early stages of early high school, it was all about fun. It wasn't until my junior year, and like this will date me, but the recruiting process didn't start until July 1 going into your senior year at the time. And so my parents and I were on a trip, and we were coming back and stopped through a couple colleges and had the chance to do kind of these unofficial visit with coaches. And one of the coaches said at that time, they're like, you're going to have the opportunity to go wherever it is that you want to go. And my parents were both kind of like, huh? Oh, wow, interesting. Like this passion had turned to opportunity what felt pretty darn quickly, because it really had been about fun. And yes, there was drive, and I was hard on myself, and I worked really hard, but ultimately I loved it. And it was supported by the people I loved, but it never, my athleticism never eclipsed how I felt people valued me as a human. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm really grateful that I just got to be in it as long as I did from a place of love versus expectation or pressure.
Katie was having fun as a high school runner, and she was racing well enough that, as predicted, she was sought after by several colleges for her running talents. And when it came to deciding where to go, Katie wanted to choose during the early signing period. This was between June and November, coming into her senior year of high school. And once that recruitment period opened in June, Katie became busy fielding her prospects.
And so started conversations with coaches. Coaches came to my house. I did some official visits and started to get clear on what feels like it's going to be the right fit for me. Offers were made, things of that nature. And ultimately, I ended up choosing University of Oregon, not for its iconic history, but solely because of the relationship that I formed and had with the coach. She had been a coach at my high school my freshman year only. And I really valued her, and I felt understood by her. I felt like it was going to be a strong place of belonging. And so I signed early, and I remember completing the state meet, and then I did this border clash race that was after state, and I crossed the finish line, and Marnie, who was the coach at Oregon, was on the phone and wanted to talk to me. And I remember that moment of just feeling so assured that I had made the right decision, because she tracked my rate. Like, keep in mind, this was like before what we think of the sports scene and internet and access to results. She had followed my race and was aware of how I did and was right there to celebrate that from afar with me right when I crossed the finish line. And that felt so reassuring. It just felt right. It really, there was not a doubt in my mind, aside from like the realistic part, right? Of like, okay, this is like the next step. But there really wasn't a doubt in my mind that she was the right person and this was the right place.
Feeling confident about her choice to attend the University of Oregon, which is indeed a legendary running school, Katie entered her freshman year.
I ended up with this roommate who's still a dear friend today, and we'll we'll even try to piece some of the pieces together still of like, wow, what the heck happened? It was so confusing, but you also didn't have a reference point, right? So you're new to a school, you're new to a program, you're new to this living situation of living in the dorms with somebody who was a stranger before you entered the room. And so there were so many transitions happening that this dear friend and I often would pause and be like, like, this is interesting. Like, for sure not what we expected, but like, is this the norm? And so things like questioning of what we should be eating, how we should look, what it should feel like, if curfews were normal, if relationships with the boys team or other people in college was always scrutinized and questioned. It was confusing. It really started off as confusing, as that you couldn't really necessarily quantify, right? Like, you're an 18-year-old, you're already like treading water to try to figure it out and find your place of belonging and prove your worth and compete to the degree in which you want. You're now the bottom of the of the ranking versus, most of us coming in, we're at the top having left high school, so that, you're just trying to figure it out. And it was I remember thinking like, this is different than I thought. I feel Marnie's support, but there feels like there's some limitations that honestly, I didn't know until 15 to 18 years later. Then it all started to make sense. But in the time, it's like you just kind of go through the motions. It felt weird that Marnie ends up having to cut a portion of the women's team without any real explanation other than these folks are now gone. One of those people was my roommate, who had felt like my ally from the time that I stepped on campus. She was my person. She was the one that, like, we were in it together. We supported each other. We kind of processed like the nuances of it all. And winter break, she was gone. And so I went back after winter break to a room by myself and my primary person gone. Sometime in there, the head coach gives his notice that he is going to leave. At some point, Marnie gives her notice that she is going to leave. And so it's in upheaval, right? This other coach steps in as this interim coach, and he was incredible. Just like a kind man who was a solid coach and an even more ethical and kind and considerate human. And he, I was kind of hopeful that he would get the head coaching job. He didn't end up getting it. And so summer, we all go home with this like kind of question mark of like, what's going to happen? Over the summer, we get notice that Vinland Anna got the head coaching job, and he was this like, still is like really reputable coach. I had teammates from high school who went and competed for him at Stanford. They and their families spoke so highly of him. And so I was excited. I was excited to have the opportunity to train with him, and it, for whatever reason, believed it was going to be a smooth transition. When Vin and crew came in, it was immediate that I knew, I don't think this is going to be a good match. There was an early season meet. He gave the whole team a race plan in the middle of the race. One of the gals just like took off out of the gates, and she had become a friend. And I said to her after the race, like, what the heck? Like, what happened to the race plan? And she's like, I was given a different one. And so at our preseason camp, I asked Vin, I said, hey, like, I'm just confused. Like, is this how it's going to be? Like, that this is going to be how programs will be structured. And he said ultimately, like, we didn't know what you were capable of, so it will look different. So that kind of gave me this boost of, okay, like, maybe this will work. There was just like, we all needed this like acclimation period of time, and it didn't. There was a moment in that season that I remember feeling this shift of where I stopped really running from this place of love and started running more for a place of approval. Like, I wanted to earn my keep. I wanted to prove my worth. I felt like I needed to prove my worth. They didn't recruit me. They aren't the ones that believed in me. They aren't the ones that wanted me there. They just inherited me, right, from this program. And that was probably more of a me thing than even what they did or didn't do. I have no idea, but I remember feeling that way. And that was tough. It was really hard. That being said, I actually ran quite well until the wheels kind of came off the bus. But I look back on it. There was a moment in time that running is such an interesting sport in terms of body and relationship to body and weight and all those things. And I was really, really thin. And I remember that season having a conversation of like, hey, I haven't had my period in months, and being told, you know what, that's great. That's like your body fat. That must mean that's like right where it's supposed to be. And then walking into the training room for a massage and knowing what I weighed, which was 117, which was really, really light. And walking into the training room and being told by somebody that they looked at me and they said, wow, like, what are you, like 103 or something? And I remember in that moment, again, this is not a healthy mindset. This is a 19-year-old brain that is in a hypervigilant state, thinking like, oh shoot, is that what I'm supposed to be? Right. And they weren't necessarily meaning that, but it was definitely celebrated that I was thin. And what we know is that when we are not making healthy choices and we're overtraining and underfueling, that is not sustainable. So I feel really lucky that I now don't grapple with an eating disorder. And I look back somewhat surprised given the choices that I was making during that time. And I got results. I did run well that season. And that's the scary part of it all, right? The important point to punctuate is I ran well that season and I never competed again. I did not compete after that. And the story that I had remembered until I started looking into my own medical records during the process of writing The Price She Pays, the wheels kind of came off the bus. There were conversations with Vin about him requesting or asking or inquiring. I don't want to put language in his mouth. This is what I recall from that time of, why don't you medical redshirt? Why don't you medical redshirt? We'll make sure that like school continues to get paid for, but it'll come from this different bucket, yada, yada, yada. And I remember that making me just so angry because all I wanted to do was run. I wanted to get well. I wanted to be able to run. I wanted to be able to compete. I wanted to reach my potential that I thought I had as an athlete. And I ended up, there was once Vin came in, Alberto unofficially was kind of around the track. He was not a staff member at U of O, but he was around and he was coaching one of the male athletes. And he took me under his wing and helped me. And he was a hero in my story for a lot of years, that he continued to believe in me and he fought for me. He referred me to Dr. Brown in Texas, who prescribed me thyroid medication. And I felt seen. I felt valued. I felt like they also saw my potential. And so I did what they told me to do, and I followed it to a T, and they had relationships with my parents. So it felt like it was all above board and totally fine.
It felt totally fine, but it wasn't. Dr. Brown had diagnosed Katie with a thyroid condition. What she didn't know then and would not know for years to come is that she actually never had a thyroid condition. But at the time, for Katie, she felt like she was being cared for by an elite coach and a doctor who was an expert in working with athletes. And so she followed their protocols. The problem is, however, that this was really dangerous.
My thyroid would get so low that I would pass out. So there's medical records that I passed out while I was driving. I passed out in my room, and my roommate had to take me to the ER because of what they call doctor-induced hyperthyroidism. So I was being misdosed. The thyroid medication was having severe physical responses. So I look back now and I'm like, well, no wonder I wasn't able to compete, because my whole system was out of alignment. And so ultimately, but I continued doing it. And there's even one point where the ER doctors took me off the thyroid medicine after they realized what my dosing was at. And over a 2-month period of time, my thyroid stabilized. And I then made the choice, and I don't remember the specifics of this. Quite frankly, I don't even remember it happening, other than that I read it in the ER doctor's notes, that I made the choice to go back on the thyroid medication and reestablish that relationship with Alberto and Dr. Brown. And under the notion that I felt them as an elite coach and a doctor who worked specifically with athletes, better understood what athletes need than just a general medical practitioner. And my performance didn't improve. I wasn't training with the team at Oregon. And so it got to a point where I was so defeated that I made the choice that I was going to quit. And I was going to take Vin up on this medical retirement thing. And I went in and I quit. And much to the dismay of my parents. And I remember my mom saying at one point, like, what? You're really going to let this man take away have the power to take away something that you love? And it got to a point where, yes, I was, because I couldn't keep doing it. And I recall it being within hours, let's say it was a day or so, Alberto called me and said, hold on, I heard you quit. You cannot do that. You at least have to transfer. He offered me to come train with his group in Portland, the Nike Oregon project. And for some reason, and quite frankly, I do thank my lucky stars for this, I really wanted to compete on a team and be in the NCAA and finish my degree. And so he offered to help me transfer, and he did successfully help me transfer and receive another full ride scholarship.
Katie chose to transfer to Florida State University. She had done her research on the head coach, and she had had some promising conversations with him before making her decision. She thought he'd be a good fit. This coach seemed to understand where she was at and what she needed.
So I made that choice. He felt like he was going to be a right fit. And in the summer, when I was getting prepped, ready to go, and he and I had these agreements that there was going to be 3 years of eligibility left. We were going to take it slow. He knew I was coming in, pretty wounded, that we would phase in. So we would start with low mileage and phase up to higher mileage. And that seemed really hopeful. There wasn't going to be this like insane amount of pressure to like rush back into this like peak fitness conditioning state. And he was going to give me a runway. He was going to give me some time to build into it. And I needed that. And so midway through the summer, he gives me a call and he says, hey, Katie, I just wanted to let you know that there's going to be a coaching change, and I'm bringing on this female coach who's going to take over the women. I'm going to predominantly be working with the men, but I'm going to stay connected to the women. And given everything I know you've been through, I really just wanted you to know firsthand what was happening. And I mean, the like part of me that I am glad was intact, this like purity of like just acceptance of, okay, I believe you. I believe you that that's how this is going to go. And I did. And then I showed up on campus, and this new assistant coach had a different game plan and wanted me to prove my worth right out of the gates. And quite frankly, I wanted to prove my worth right out of the gates. And I pushed it too hard, and she also wanted me to push it too hard and upped my mileage quickly. I had no complaints about that, and did not share with her any reluctancy of doing that. So I take full responsibility for that. Ultimately ended up getting injured, right? Upped mileage too quickly, disconnected from body, didn't pay attention. I got some stress fractures in my foot, tore all the tendons and ligaments in my ankle, spent the next 9 months in a boot. And at one point, one of the most prominent memories from that period of time was telling her about the injury. And I met her in the infield of the track one day before practice and apologized, like, I'm really sorry. I just got out of the MRI and I am injured. And I don't know if I will ever forget the look in her eye. And she looked at me and said, "You are the biggest waste of money this program has ever had." And I was like, believed her. I believed her. Like, I felt the same way. I felt like a waste of money. I felt like a bad investment. I was not proving my worth because here I was unable to perform. I got injured right out of the gates and accepted that as like some deep personal fault. And I remember I had just met who is now my now husband. I remember calling him in tears and saying, "Oh my gosh, what is wrong with me? I am the common denominator in all of these equations." And I felt that. I was super shameful. And what I do know now is that I am not surprised. Like, I believe in the mind-body connection, and I hadn't taken care or healed any of the wounds that had happened from or at Oregon. I didn't even realize the magnitude of what was currently happening with Alberto. And then I jump into this new program expecting physical results, and I wasn't paying attention, and my body intervened and literally broke.
Katie was broken. She hadn't healed those wounds that she'd experienced at the University of Oregon, and she hadn't even begun to understand the harm that was being caused by the work she still continued to do with Salazar and Brown, even after her transfer to Florida State. Katie continued to take the thyroid medication, and the dosages that she was prescribed were vigilantly monitored. Looking back on Salazar today, it might be easy to forget what a strong force this man was, and that he was a trusted coach at the highest level of the sport. In the eyes of a traumatized, broken young athlete, getting personalized attention from such a larger-than-life figure is incredibly powerful.
He was charming and knowledgeable and really sincere. I can't think of a specific example, but I do recall the essence of his just care. It really felt sincere to me. It felt very real. I had been an athlete in Oregon, so I had crossed paths with him at some races, and he was kind, like felt sincerely kind and believable. There wasn't reason there. I didn't have tangible reason not to believe him. And I did. I trusted him. And I must have, to some degree, craved that approval and the support. And there must have been an element of admiration because I did do what he said. And my mom recalls times that he called my parents and would say, "Hey, I can't get a hold of Katie. Can you call her? I need her to go to the lab immediately so that we can take her blood up to Canada." And I do it. Like, no questions asked. Anything they said to do, I did. Change your dose, I'll do it. Get your blood drawn, I'll do it. Do it right now, absolutely. There was a deep trust, and I don't know if I missed something. I don't know if my parents missed something, but what I'll say is my parents, he was friendly with my parents. And I look at it now and I'm like, wow, like the degree in which he went to, and I do wanted to give the disclaimer, like, I have not been able to get in touch with Alberto. I have tried to get answers and to try to get some clarification to these questions I have. I believe he used me for manipulation to better understand what medication would do so that he could use it with his elite athletes. But that is a hypothesis. He has never confirmed that, but he's also never answered my calls to be able to provide me another option or alternative belief of what he was doing. So it was it was believable. He was believable. He was likable. He went above and beyond to make sure I was taken care of. I believed him. Was he taking care of me? No, he was exploiting me. But it felt like he was taking care of me and that he believed in my potential, and I so desperately wanted to run. I so desperately wanted to compete, and maybe that was part of the problem.
Katie continued working with Salazar and Brown even after graduating from Florida State, even after her running career had ended. And while Katie and even her parents believed that she was legitimately being cared for, Katie's then boyfriend and now husband was not so convinced.
The first person to really point out that it was odd was Adam. And he was a runner. He'd been at the professional stage. He'd won NCAAs. He was an elite runner. He knew the landscape. He'd achieved results. And he saw doping and corruption on the world stage in a way that I had never. And so he was the first one to say, this is suspicious. This is weird. What are you doing? Especially because I was not performing. So why were they still invested? And that's the part where I'm convinced, or I believe, that they were using my results and my medication adjustments for some other motive, whatever that was, because they stayed hooked in beyond the time in which I was competing. And for me, I saw that as like, I'm not competing. I'm not providing you with anything. So why else would you be doing this other than that you care about me?
Katie could not see why they would do all of this unless they cared about her. And then she learned the truth.
I found out about the misdiagnosed thyroid disorder at 28 years old when I was sitting in a fertility doctor's office. I didn't know, right? At that point, I'd been taking a thyroid med for years. The doctor tried to take me off of it. My body's become reliant on it. I'll take it for the rest of my life. That's something I, reconcile regularly. I think, especially in this period of time, all of that I just shared, there's so much heartbreak in that, right? There's so many things that just like went wrong. But what I really feel at the end of the day is I would have done none of this work, professional work with the book and the foundation, had I not had this deep, deep belief that sport is worth fighting for. There is so much goodness in sport, and there are so many amazing people in sport, right? It is something that even though I went through this experience, if my kids love sport, I will encourage them to engage in sport. I believe in it that deeply. I love my kids more than anything in the world and would not subject them to something that I thought was going to do harm. I think there are way more pros than cons, and we need to be making adaptations to ensure that we're preserving the human part of the athlete as well. That yes, let's help them get to these results and achieve greatness and push their potential, but not at the cost of their soul.
Not at the cost of their soul. Not at the cost of their soul, their well-being, their health. This does bring us to the end of Katie Steele's running story on the podcast, and I want to give a deep thank you to Katie for sharing her story here and in her book. Thank you, Katie. I wholeheartedly encourage you to read this book if you have an interest in women's sports, which I'm assuming you do because you're here. Like I mentioned up top, many of the harmful factors brought to life in Katie's story still exist today. The types of things that happen to her and other practices that are harmful to female athletes are outlined in The Price She Pays. On a more personal note, this book and Katie's story make me deeply sad. First of all, because what happened to Katie is really awful. And while her experiences are really different from my own in many, many ways, I also experienced the harmful side of sport. And when I look back, I realize how unnecessary so much of it was. So it makes me sad for Katie, it makes me sad for myself, And it makes me really sad that all these years later, this is still happening. So I stand with Katie and Tiffany and Erin in stating that there needs to be fundamental change in how we deal with women and girl athletes, because sport is so amazing. I love being an athlete. It is a really fundamental part of who I am. And that shines through in Katie's story too. Like I mentioned, she still loves to move her body and explore the outdoors, but mostly on her mountain bike these days. She does continue to heal her relationship with running, but it's a work in progress. Being an athlete and being competitive is central to so many women's and girls' well-being, and it just does not need to cause the sort of harm and devastation that it so regularly does. And in fact, I firmly believe that supporting the whole healthy athlete in the ways that are advocated for in The Price She Pays will actually make women better athletes. Katie let me know that she's heard pushback from coaches and other people in the sports world that this sort of support is going to make women athletes soft. I could not disagree more. I believe it will make us stronger, faster, more resilient, and better performing athletes. All right. Please look to the show notes for ways to keep up with Katie Steele and also for ways that you can purchase The Price She Pays. That does bring me to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for being here. I always appreciate you listening. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of Women's Running Stories. And until next Tuesday, I do wish you whole body healthy, joyful strides forward. Women's running. Women's running stories.
Running should be simple. Just put on your shoes and go. And yet, when you try to learn about how to get better at it, especially as you age, you're confronted with conflicting advice, complicated workouts, and confusing nutrition trends that just won't work for you. On The Planted Runner, I'll share exactly how to run faster, longer, and feel great doing it at any age because you don't have time to waste. I'm Coach Claire Bartholic, and I went from not running at all in my late 30s to finishing a marathon in 2:58 at age 42, all on a plant-based diet. I've helped hundreds of runners achieve new personal records well into their 60s and even 70s with science-backed training, plant-based nutrition, and proven mental strength techniques. Each episode of The Planted Runner is like a private coaching session on the run where you'll learn from me and the guests I interview. You'll get actionable lessons to help you become a better runner every week and reach goals you never thought possible. Whether you're training for your first 5K or your 50th marathon, take along The Planted Runner on your next run. Let me show you how your best running is still ahead of you.